In 2017, an author was sitting in a jail cell, wondering if he would ever make it out alive. He had been sentenced to life imprisonment for his involvement in an international fraud. Now, with his entire future ahead of him, or so he thought, he sat down and wrote a story about a man who was also convicted of fraud. The strange part of this story is that the main character in the book is also named James Frey. This story went on to become a New York Times bestseller and got its author famous. So how did this guy write a best-selling novel from prison? And what was his story? Welcome to my channel. Today, let's meet the author who became famous thanks to a New York Times bestseller. But before we begin, please subscribe. James Frey was born in Cleveland, Ohio, and spent his childhood in a small town called Chagrin Falls. His father owned a car dealership and a tow truck company, so money was not really a problem when James was young. James always had enough money to buy whatever he wanted, but he never had enough attention from his parents. They were emotionally distant and didn't care much about what their son was up to, because they were always busy with work and their social life. James spent most of his time alone. This made him introverted, and he found solace in reading books. He would spend hours and hours at the local library. That's where he developed a passion for writing too. He started writing stories and poems, and by the time he turned 17, he had already written 2 novels. Unfortunately, he never pursued his passion for writing. Instead, he went to college to study political science. He graduated in 1993 and began working for his dad's company. A few years later, James married and settled down in Ohio, but he still wasn't happy. He knew there was more to life than just working and providing for his family. That's when he decided to pursue his dream of becoming a novelist. He quit his job and enrolled in a creative writing course at Columbia University. A year later, his first novel, The Full Dark, No Stars, was published. It received generally favorable reviews, but it didn't sell many copies, so James went back to his old job. For a while, he tried balancing his job and writing, but eventually he quit his job again to focus solely on writing. In the meantime, his second novel, The Good Father, was also published. Again, the critics liked his writing, but sales were poor. With no money to support himself and a mountain of debt, James had to file for bankruptcy. And, to add to his misery, his marriage fell apart, and he had to get a divorce. He moved to Manhattan and got a small apartment. Things were looking bad. But then, in 2004, everything changed. His third novel, My Lovely Wife, was published and became an instant bestseller. It sold more than 6 million copies. My Lovely Wife was the story of a seemingly ordinary couple who had a secret. Behind closed doors, the husband was a serial killer. Even though his other novels were about crime and murder, this one was different. It caught the attention of the New York Times and other major newspapers. Critics were hailing him as the next Stephen King. Suddenly, James Frey was everywhere. He went on talk shows, podcasts, interviews, you name it. It seemed like things couldn't get any better. But then, in 2006, James's life took a turn for the worse. In February, the New York Times ran a lengthy investigation into his life story. They discovered a lot of discrepancies between what he said and what the truth was. It came out that many details in his personal life were fabricated. He had claimed that he was a former drug addict and that he had spent time in rehab, but those claims were false. Not only that, but he had also claimed that his father abused him and his mother abandoned him. Those things never happened either. So why did James lie about such things? Well, it's because he knew those stories would make him more famous and more successful. And that's exactly what happened. Even though people found out that he lied, his career didn't suffer much. If anything, it skyrocketed even higher. But now we know that James was willing to do anything to chase fame and fortune. You would think that someone like that wouldn't be able to survive in prison, especially since he had been sentenced to life imprisonment, but somehow he managed. So, how did he end up in prison? Well, that goes back to 2008. Frey was involved in a telemarketing scam. It was run by a man named Scott Roth. They were selling fake diet pills. Over the years, they made millions of dollars. But eventually, the FBI got wind of it and arrested everyone involved, including James Frey. He was charged with conspiracy to commit mail and wire fraud. Frey was hoping he could strike a plea bargain, but he was denied one, so he decided to go to trial. Unfortunately, the jury found him guilty and he was sentenced to life imprisonment. Now, you might be thinking, this is all ridiculous. How can someone like James Frey be sentenced to life imprisonment for selling fake diet pills? Well, the reason is simple. Although the scam made around $200 million, authorities could only recover $50 million of it. And James had used some of the money to buy 2 mansions, a speedboat, and a private jet. So the judge ordered that those assets be confiscated and sold. The government got $22 million from selling his stuff, which left them with $25 million to recover. They considered this an economic offense, which meant James could be sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. As soon as he heard his sentence, James fainted. He couldn't believe what he had heard. He was sentenced to life in prison for selling fake diet pills. What's more, he was sent to a maximum security prison called ADX Florence in Colorado. It's one of the most secure prisons in America. Inmates are kept in solitary confinement. They're only allowed out of their cells for 1 hour every day, and they're not allowed to interact with other prisoners. Only a few people have managed to escape from ADX Florence, and all of them were caught. It's basically impossible to break out of this prison. So what was James Frey doing in there? He had a wife and 3 kids. He had access to a lawyer. Why didn't he appeal the decision? Well, because he knew he had done something wrong. He had made millions of dollars selling fake diet pills to innocent people. But he wasn't remorseful. Instead, he was angry. Angry at himself for getting caught and angry at the world for sentencing him to life in prison. That's when he decided to write a story about a fraudster who was wrongfully convicted and sentenced to life in prison. The story was inspired by his own life, but it wasn't autobiographical. It was a fictional story about a man named James Frey. The book was published in 2017. It was called The Lives of the Saints. One critic said it was raw, honest, and touching. Another said it was smart, sharp, and unforgettable. These reviews helped the book reach No. 3 on the New York Times bestseller list. Nowadays, James Frey has another bestseller under his belt. He's currently working on his next novel and hopes to be released from prison in 10 years. Thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.